Hi, I'm Gareth, and in this video we're going to have a little think about the history of musical pitch, which may at first sight look a rather tedious title, but you might find it's actually quite interesting. Many people will have been to an orchestral concert and will have noticed how the orchestra usually tunes before the concert begins. And the first thing you hear, apart from everybody kind of warming up and getting sorted out, is you hear an oboe play an A. It's this A, which is A, the 6 above middle C. And what the oboist does is either to use a tuning fork or one of these electronic tuning devices to pick an A that it's at this pitch. This is our standard pitch, 440 HZ. So the oboist gets their own instrument in tune on an A at 440, sounds the A, and the rest of the orchestra tune to 440. So it's a frequency of pitch. And if you buy a modern standard tuning fork, well, you'll probably find that that should give you an A at 440 as well. So maybe you sing in a choir or a barbershop group or something where the leader, the conductor, whatever, has got a tuning fork. They'll give it a quick tap, boom, and they've got that A 440 in their ear in order to give you notes that you can then sing a cappella with if that's what you're doing. So it's a standard pitch. So our assumption might be that in fact this has been the pitch forever. But that's not the case. In fact, A440 was established really quite late in the process. It wasn't until 1834 when a guy called Johann Heinrich Schiebler came along and established A as 440. And then it took us until 1926, believe it or not, for it to become a standard in instrument manufacture. I mean, can you believe that before then we had different manufacturers kind of doing A's slightly different pitches? Gosh, that's a bit of a nightmare, isn't it? And then it was another 10 years, 1936, before it was adopted as a standard by the American Standards Association. And incredibly, took until 1955 before 40 was absolutely recognised as by the sort of International Organisation for Standardisation. So what on earth went on before that? Well, before we got A established at 440, a lot of performance was based on an earlier French level, which was 435. And that was established in the 1860s. Well, 435 doesn't sound very far away from 440. Well, it isn't, but it does make a fractional difference to the pitch. And there's a lot of discussion about this, and by saying this, we're bound to provoke some, which is absolutely fine. Anything you want to write about this, just put in the comment box underneath the video. It's quite an interesting topic when you get into it. But a lot of modern discussion now is based on sort of authentic performance of music of the past. So if you're going to play Baroque music, do you really want to play it at A equals 440? Well, if you're going to play it on modern instruments, then you haven't really got much of a choice because they're pitched at 440. But the general consensus is that Baroque pitch was probably generally about 415. Now, 415 does make a bit of a difference. But we've also got evidence that some Baroque pitch went up to 466. While a lot of classical period music was pitched at about 430. So you can see how things have bounced up and down all over the landscape. And even within the Baroque period, we know that there were different standards of pitch going on. And so until we really got into some attempt to standardise A at 440, there was a huge variation in pitch. How do we know that? Well, one thing that's actually quite helpful for this is to look at organ tuning of the past. Even at the beginning of the 20th century, organs were being built slightly on the sharp side. And speaking as an organist, this can be a real problem when you go somewhere to record with instrumentalists and you suddenly discover the organ pitch is a bit on the sharp side and the orchestra are all moaning like heck that they've got to tune a bit sharp to catch up with the organ because it wasn't tuned originally. The pipes weren't made to sound A equals 440, and there's not a lot you can do about that. I mean, there are things you can do with pipes. You can shave bits off to make them a bit shorter, which of course will make them a bit sharper still, or you can stick bits on some of the pipes to make them a bit longer. But it's a fairly major surgical business to go through an organ, messing about with the length of all the pipes to try and change the fundamental pitch of the organ. So it's interesting that organs, even at the beginning of the 20th century, were not always tuned at a 440 pitch. We know that if we go back to the organ tuning of the 17th century, you'll find a variance between organs and modern pitch of up to 5 semitones, which is absolutely very significant. So if you've got something that's 5 semitones away from something else, well, that's pretty difficult, isn't it? We've got other bits of evidence as well that are quite handy. Like, for example, did you know that Handel's tuning fork for A is still to be found? And that's tuned at 422.5. Okay, so that was Handel. We've got Beethoven's tuning fork, and his tuning fork was tuned at A455.4. So you've got another difference there. Instrumentalists of the past, by the way, often actually quite like the pitch to be a bit higher, because they found that actually it created a slightly brighter sound, a brighter tone on the instrument, to have the pitch just at a little higher than it maybe normally was. So that gets quite interesting. We then, of course, as the instrumentalists want to have this brighter sound by taking the pitch a bit on the sharp side, all the singers then start moaning. You know, if you're singing in a choir or you're singing in the opera and the instrumentalists have taken a shine to push everything a bit sharp, suddenly there's a kind of extra strain on the voice, especially when you go up to the higher notes, and the singers didn't like it very much. So quite a bit of discussion went on about this, and people having their own agendas, you know, instrumentalists who wanted it a bit on the sharper side, singers objecting, saying, no, we need it back a bit lower, and quite a lot of variation around the place. So the conventions of pitch differed considerably, you know, between one orchestra and another, one country and another. Things like organ tuning, even the tuning of things like brass bands has varied. And even today, when we have 440 as our standard pitch, there's still some variation around. For example, if you really want to get into this forensically, have a listen to some of the New York Philharmonic recordings. And if you can really get your ear into this, you'll find that A for them is sometimes 442. So just slightly different. Some European orchestras have got A running at 443. So even though this is now the standard, you'll still find some variation. But if you're a keyboard player, then if your piano tuner comes around, for example, then he or she is very likely to try and tune your A to 440. And sometimes a piano tuner will say, well, I'm really sorry, this piano is so flat, I can't afford to pull it up to 440 because there's a risk that the tension on the strings will be too great and it might actually break the strings. In the past, there were some pianos that tuners didn't like to go up to 440 anyway, because they had wooden frames that were not strong enough to cope with the tension, which is why nowadays most modern pianos have got iron frames. You know, they'll take any amount of tension you want to throw at them. So we're talking about this A as a standard of 440, which is what you're expecting when you play a keyboard instrument. So if I play this A above middle C, that is 440, and that is our standard. That's what those oboists are playing in the orchestra. And another way that this is sometimes talked about is the A above C4. So if you ever get that and you wonder what on earth C4 is, so it should be this. The lowest C on a piano will be there, so that's C1, next octave C2, next octave C3, next octave C4, and it's the A above C4 that is the one we're talking about here. So this is not a topic that will fascinate everybody, but I think there may be some interest in it because we just assume that A's always been the pitch that A is. Yet music of the past has moved around hugely in pitch, and even music of the present, you'll find some variation in the standard of A. But there is our standard, A equals 440. So have fun listening to music and thinking, have these guys got it right? Or have they got their own version of A?